Hello, I'm Greg Livingston, and I'm back again for more level design analysis with level 1 of Gradius on NES. Now, in the meantime, I've filled out the video with the notes on the rest of the level. For instance, here's all the challenges that come in the body of the level. There's actually 21 distinct challenges within the level. And just some tiny notes on stuff that happens at the end of the level. So now that all this is in place, I'm ready to kind of formalize these observations. So I'm going to open a new article. I'm going to make it about Gradius 1, or Gradius Level 1 level design. So the article tool takes after Wikipedia style of design, where you have an outline and then content that fills out portions of the outline. So for instance, I'm just going to say all this is about level 1. And when I'm talking about level 1, I'm going to want to cover layers. And layers refers to the content that composes the level design. So I'm just going to leave a body segment explaining that. And I'm talking about Gradius NES here. So I'm going to put that under the game. And then this is the body that's going to appear under the layers section. So here we go. Under level 1 layers, I have here an explanation that says the layers portion talks about the individual elements that compose the level design. Now that's not the only thing I want to talk about in level 1. I also want to make sure I cover the challenges in level 1. And this segment will cover how the elements come together in the moment. If you think about it, this is kind of like the mechanics, where the layers are the kind of objective individual bits and pieces that go into a game, whereas the challenges, they reflect how those bits and pieces are used at runtime. So they might be more like the dynamics of the game. And finally, that's not even enough, because when we discuss challenges, that's individual pieces of the level still. So to cover how the level comes together as a whole, I want to get to the macro level of level design. So this would be covering, if challenges cover how individual elements build up into a single challenge, then the macro level covers how the challenges build up to form a whole level. And already it started building us this outline. If I go ahead and hit save, now it's formatted, and I can click to skip to a part of the outline. Now, in particular, layers are parsed by the design space, so that the different classes of elements are how you would want to group these, which would depend on the game, but I think in Gradius, the best way to go about it would be to talk about the environment, the enemies, and the power-ups. Now the environment in Gradius Level 1 is pretty simple. All of it kills Vic Viper immediately. Most of it is just a flat floor and a flat ceiling, but you do have some mountains about a quarter the height of the screen, and they're just a diagonal incline and a diagonal decline. There is one exception. Oh, well, there are two exceptions to that, actually. One of the mountains has a tunnel that Vic can just fly through, and another one of the mountains is like a double mountain where instead of being grounded to the ground, they are grounded to each other in like a diagonal, or a diamond shape, and that appears at the very end of the level. So that makes it pretty easy to take notes on the environment. Now for the enemies, I don't really remember all the different enemies, so Gradius, yes. Level 1. Let me see if I can find my notes here. So here we have intro segment. So now I've got zigzag enemies, tracking enemies, sine wave enemies. Yeah, so here I've got my note on the body of the level that discusses the different challenges. So from this I'm going to try to pick out just every unique enemy. So there were also turrets. Oh, those bouncing enemies. Duckers. Hatches. Yeah, that covers it. Okay, so for the 21 challenges in this level, all of them came out of, what, 7 different enemy types? So that's pretty cool. That they're able to mix and match some stuff to such an extent that they... feels like they really must have wrung these out. At least from the casual observation. I can also look at this to get how many power-ups are in the level. Gradius is a little different where power-ups are kind of like currency. You don't really obtain something as soon as you pick it up. Instead, you get points to spend on other stuff. So the best I can think of is to count the number of power-ups per segment. I could enter that here, but I think it might be more useful to enter a table note. So just to go back, by default in the article tool, I'm going to be entering this more simple note, but I can view the full note form if I want access to all the different stuff. And so I can change my note type to table. So from there, okay, here's my intro segment. And how many power-ups do I have there? I have 5, 8, 10 power-ups in the intro segment. Well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 power-ups. I'm going to submit, and there we go. Now my article has a nice table in it that says how many power-ups are in each segment. So that brings us to the end of the layers. If I go ahead and save, now I've got a nicely formatted article already coming along. Let's go ahead though. So just like how layers are broken up, I also want to break up the challenges segment. So one way that challenges come together is through counterpoint, which just observes the way in which the different layers overlap one another. So for instance, how does the environment layer work with the enemy layer? And that would be the counterpoint. There would also be the difficulty or the skills required to overcome a challenge. And there would also be fairness, which deals with the presentation of the challenge, whether the challenge is presented fairly. So just reviewing the intro of the level, during the intro phase, enemy formations are staggered. They don't really lump up on top of each other, so there is no counterpoint. However, the body of the level has a lot of counterpoint. Now I could go down these 21 challenges with you, but instead I'm just going to write them off screen. So for these 21 challenges, there's a fair bit of unique counterpoint setups that, even though the level only had 7 enemies, it still ended up with this huge list of counterpoint. One thing that I think is really compelling about Gradius is that ground enemies entice the player to approach the ground. So, although the terrain is lethal to Vic Viper, Vic's primary attack is horizontal. So, to beat ground enemies, Vic has to get close to the dangerous ground. So that's one interesting aspect about counterpoint, that when you pair an enemy with the environment, then you have a challenge there where Vic has to get close and risk getting hurt. Or alternatively, it's an incentive to use powers, because Vic can get around this by using a displaced option, or the double, or the missile. Because an option can be someplace that Vic is not, the missile will go down to the ground, and the double will go up to the ceiling. One thing that gets combined with enemies a lot is the mountain. The mountain gets combined with pretty much every enemy in the level, but they all, some of them work with it differently, where the duckers will walk on the mountain and change their elevation, so that makes it harder to hit them, because they're more of a moving target. Whereas the bouncing enemies and the sine wave enemies pass through the mountain, so they can kind of pop out from behind cover and immediately strike at Vic Viper. Just as more of a summary, counterpoint spans a wide range of combinations, so they really ran the gamut here, combining everything with everything. With regards to the end of the level, the volcanoes and the big core really appear on their own. There's not much counterpoint during the ending of the level. So that's that for counterpoint. Difficulty can come in 5 categories. There's knowledge, dexterity. I actually put these in the wrong order, so let's want dexterity before knowledge. There's reflexes. There's timing. And there's adaptation. Dexterity is uniquely interesting for Gradius because the player can opt into higher dexterity challenges by giving Vic Viper more speed-ups, that the faster Vic gets, the harder it is to control. But even without that, the player is going to need dexterity just to get around enemies. Plus, the player will need a level of control approaching ground targets just to get the ship close to the ground without hitting the ground itself. I think knowledge comes into two key portions. First is that since it's auto-scrolling, long-term knowledge can really help the player memorize what's coming up ahead of time, whereas a new player is going to have more trouble with something auto-scrolling because they're immediately exposed to it for the first time and can't really slow it down to observe. But there's also the element of muscle memory, that if the player is more familiar with Vic Viper at higher speeds, then that will be ingrained in their muscle memory, and so that'll help them play better. Reflexes are like the #1 skill that I'm lacking in shooters. In all shooters, reflexes are key just to follow the bullets and enemies that are whizzing by on screen. In this first level of Gradius in particular, you have enemies appearing at the top and the bottom of the screen. So right off the bat, the player needs to be able to watch a wide span of space. Enemies can also shoot bullets as they leave the screen, which I think is called sniping. So the player needs to be able to watch the left of the screen, even while stuff is coming in on the right side of the screen. Although the player can tamp down on that somewhat by making sure nothing comes past. And if the player has a double and a missile, that will kill enemies above and below and kind of ease that strain as well. Timing, on the other hand, I think is pretty lenient in this first level. Enemies are very slow. It's easy to see where bullets are going. So I don't think there's much use to studying any of the timing here. On the other hand, the big core has a lot of health, and an easy way, or a common way to take care of an enemy with a lot of health is to point blank so as to spawn as many bullets as possible, score more hits than you might from farther away. The issue with point blanking is that the big core can do the same right back to Vic Viper, can just kill Vic Viper, in a moment's notice. So to point blank the big core requires internalizing the timing of when the big core is going to shoot. In Gradius, I think adaptation has one big benefit. This is when you lean off of one skill and onto another. So if you're not very familiar with the level design, you might not have that long-term memory there from knowledge. But if you're good with higher speed ships, you might have good dexterity. So that's one common way that you can adapt in Gradius. Shift from one skill to another. With regards to fairness, there's always that caveat about auto-scrolling games. Unless you're using the pause button, Gradius comes at you and there's not really a moment of rest. Even with the pause button, you can't stop to observe what enemies will do at a safe distance because they're constantly going to be coming at you. But other than that, the stage does introduce enemies gradually. Some enemies are introduced in a pair with other enemies, like the Duckers are introduced alongside the sine wave enemies. But the more complicated counterpoint, where you get like 5 enemies lumped up together, that counterpoint is left to the end of the level. So it is pretty gentle and ramps upward from the bottom, I think. Also, another key note with regards to fairness is that there's no speed requirement for this level. That's kind of a gotcha in shooters when you discover later on that you need a certain number of speed ups to get through something. So just an important note for fairness that no matter how many speed ups you do, if your other skills are up to par, then you can get through this. Alright, so that finishes up the challenges segment. Oh, you know what? I didn't indent these correctly, so let me go back. Because knowledge, reflexes, swimming, I think that's everything. Oh, dexterity as well. There we go. So now we have a nice outline that kind of stratifies things. Now I can zoom right to whatever part I'm interested in. Alright. Let's go ahead and fill out the last portion, the macro. So this portion discusses how the level comes together as a whole, which would mean, let's get to the theme. Indent that and make sure it's correct. And the development. Now the theme discusses the range of elements, or maybe it's a better way to say that how the design space of the level comes together. Whereas development is more about the sequence, or how you get from the first challenge to the last challenge. So if I'm going to talk about the theme and the design space, that means, you know, the environment, there's like some different kinds of mountains. The power-ups, there's only one type of power-up in the game, unless you count the screen clear that enemies drop. So most of the design space comes from these different enemy types. And so, just looking at it, if I was going to build a design space chart of these enemies, very little would overlap. Most of them take one hit, aside from the hatches. But then, like, some of them are vertical and some of them are horizontal. Some of them track the player, some of them don't track the player. The turrets are even stationary. They're like the only enemies that don't move. So I feel like the design space here is pretty broad, not very focused. They're also paired with a stage that's fairly open. Really the only terrain is the mountains, aside from the big lumpy mountain in the middle of the screen at the very end of the level. So the theme comes together as more of a broad, general introduction to Gradius that allows the stage to focus on simple enemy behaviors. And the development follows that through, where it opens with an outer space segment, no terrain, so it's pretty easy to get through. And there's very little counterpoint. Enemies don't really overlap unless you leave them around for a while. And the player even gets 10 power-ups, so there's plenty of time to power up, collect what you can, and get pretty beefy before you enter the level proper. After that, the level moves into a segment with pretty gentle terrain. Most of the time you just have that flat floor and ceiling, so the terrain's pretty far away, pretty hard to hit. And the meat of the screen is filled really by popcorn enemies that die in one hit. But it's worth noting that the terrain here is pretty gentle, that incline and decline. So instead of sharp vertical cliffs to fly around, that triangle formation makes a more gentle shape that's easier to fly around. So that's important to the development of the game as a whole, that the terrain in the first level is pretty gentle compared to what you see throughout the game. The level internally, though, also has a sense of development in that it iterates through different enemy combinations, and there's a sequence of 3 challenges at the end that really ramp up the difficulty. First, there's that counterpoint of 5 different enemy types. That would be this sequence here, and this challenge here comes right before the double mountains, where you get the 2 mountains in the very middle of the screen, where most of the level has been pretty empty in the middle of the screen, and then suddenly there's this huge block of terrain taking up the middle of the space. So that's another way that the difficulty ramps up. And then right after that comes the 2 volcanoes, which shoot a bunch of rocks that kind of overwhelm the screen. And that's the 3rd challenge in that sequence there, where the difficulty really comes to a head in that very first level. After that comes the big core, which is much hardier than any other enemy in the level, but also more focused. Like, you don't have any counterpoint going on or anything. You don't have to worry about enemies coming from different sides of the screen. You really know where everything is. And the challenge is more getting to that one weak spot. So, unlike the level, which is very diverse and varied, this is a very honed challenge. And so, overall, the level increases the number of layers added on top of each other, until finally you get to the big core, which is kind of a release, and when the layering stops. And that boss is more of a relief, I think, in my opinion anyway. And so here we go, an article on the level design in Gradius Level 1. Now, the importance of stratifying all these outline elements is that, for one thing, yeah, it's helpful to know knowledge is a form of skill, so it comes under difficulty. And when we're talking about difficulty in a level, that's going to be an assessment of the challenges. But it has a utility beyond just the article tool. So if I'm looking at Gradius NES and I want to know, when did I talk about theme? And here we go. I have my theme note from this article right here. And that, I can just go to the home page, search for theme in Gradius NES, and here we go. And it's also got the other tags that I was using as part of that outline. My notes are in this article, but they're not only in this article. One of the key things that makes VG is that all of these tools are going to be generating notes that are then later indexed in this database, and you can come back and search for them individually, and then tag and categorize them as needed. And so this article tool helps to build a stratified article, but also helps you to tag information for easy access later. Even if you don't need this article, you still have individual observations. And so that's it for level design analysis in the first level of Gradius NES using VGLogger, www.vglogger.com. All right, thanks for joining me.